All right, you grasshoppers. I don't know about having this gentleman on right now. He's either the most loved man amongst owners in the National Hockey League today or the most hated man amongst owners in the National Hockey League, right? The great Mike Ozanian from Forbes magazine. Mike is famous for how many years now have you done the valuations for pro sports teams?
I think the first one was pre-World War II, but actually, since 1998 at Forbes.
All right. Wow. So like 22 years. So again, Mike on Forbes just came out yesterday, right, with all the valuations for the NHL teams and very interesting numbers. So if anybody sees it, so if everybody wants to see it, they can just go to Forbes.com, right? You have it all in there?
That's right. Yep.
Good. Mike and I have become good friends. I don't know why. I don't really haven't figured that out yet, but we'll figure it out.
I don't know what that says about us.
Yeah, really. So here's we were just discussing this. I want you to explain this to the listeners too. So on each team, you've got the valuation, you've got the year change, who owns it, obviously, and the operating income. So can you explain what operating income is?
It's basically a measure that tells you whether the business is generating cash or losing cash. So it does not include non-cash items like depreciation. So, for instance, player contracts are written down every year. Certain other assets are written down just every year, like plant and equipment gets lowered in value because it's worthless, but it's not a true expense. The owner isn't paying out cash to cover it. It's just a non-cash charge. So we're basically measuring whether these teams are generating cash or losing cash.
Right. I mean, you say that they're not necessarily writing a check for that. I mean, but if they are losing money, somebody's going to be writing a check, correct?
No, it just basically will tell you that at some point they're going to that equipment or the arena is worth less. So it tells you about the replacement value of it.
Okay. All right.
I like keeping things super, super simple. So if I'm looking to buy one of these teams, a big factor always is okay. So let's say I'm going to buy a team for $500 million. Okay, that I'm giving to the guy who currently owns the team. But I'm also thinking like, okay, over the next few years, am I going to have to put any more money in to cover losses, or will I be able to perhaps take money out and pay myself a dividend? So that's why we look at operating income, which, for technical purposes is earnings before interest, taxes, and depreciation.
Right. EBITDA. Okay. So in Rangers' case, is the most valuable team. You've got $1.65 billion. Their operating income is a plus $87 million. So is $87 million going to the Dolans then? Not necessarily.
Well, it's going to the corporation, which is Madison Square Garden, but is controlled by the Dolans through the B shares. They have all the voting stock.
Right.
So it's a public company, but the Dolans control it.
Right. So we're going into a new season now. No people. Let's assume there's no people in the seats at all, so they lose all that revenue from tickets, concessions, parking, all that. And some teams are saying that if that's the case, I mean, obviously, if they don't play 80 games, there's less of a loss, right? There's the salaries are getting deferred and the escrow payments and all that. So I mean, if these teams, like if the Islanders are losing like $37 million roughly, and if they're going to lose another, let's say $40 million, somebody's writing those checks, though, right?
Oh, absolutely. Malkin and Ledecky are definitely writing checks. What some teams are doing, it's kind of interesting too, is sometimes what will happen is if you're a very wealthy owner and you can, like you say, write the check for those losses. It's also a way sometimes where the limited partners, the guys that own, the under 50% stakes, like 1% to 2%, 5%, somewhere in there, they don't want to put in money to cover the losses. So the majority owners are sort of diluting out, that is acquiring those shares by putting in more money. That's happening in some instances too. Some teams are borrowing money. The NHL increased the league-wide credit facility to $100 million per team. Teams have tapped into that. You mentioned the Rangers. Madison Square Garden Corp actually started their own borrowing facility for the Rangers, and I think the number was about $160 million. They've borrowed into that, and of course the advantage of these league-wide facilities is because you're bundling the whole league and working off of the national revenue, the league-wide TV contracts and sponsorships. You get to borrow at a very, very cheap rate. So the league's done some of that too.
Right. So the Rangers, even though they're profitable, they put together a facility where they can borrow money from Madison Square Garden, right, from their parent company.
Yeah, well, the Garden's borrowing money from an outside source, and as you pointed out, the reason why is, and what we based our values on, the assumption we made is, okay, we just finished the last season where teams played like 70 games during the regular season in front of crowds, but then they had the playoffs in the bubbles, right? So we figured, okay, we had that last year, and it looks like, we don't know, but it looks like going into this year, they're going to probably play somewhere around 55 games or so. And we took the assumption that at least the majority of those games are going to be without fans. So that's reflected in our valuations. And the reason why it's so important, because in the NHL, 70% or so of your revenue comes from the arena.
Wow, that high, right? Yeah. So what is it in other sports like football?
It's probably like 40%, 30%, because their national TV deals are so much higher.
Right.
And so this is why these teams in the NHL are borrowing money. This is why owners are putting in money for losses. So it's a much tougher financial picture for the NHL playing during a pandemic than the other sports. So this is the first time, Tom, in 2 decades, actually 19 years, where our valuations for the NHL on average went down. They went down 2%. Because of the decline in revenue.
Right. So in a weird way, like let's say Arizona and Florida that aren't really drawing very well in those places and are losing money. In a strange way, they're less affected by this because they're already not drawing anyways, right? So
yeah, and they're less affected, but at the same time, it's a big strain on them because they don't have the financial stability of like the Rangers before the pandemic were earning like over $100 million in EBITDA. So their decline puts them, down to, 80 something million. The Maple Leafs were usually profitable. They were earning like, I don't know, 100 million too. They're down to like 50 or something. They had a very high payroll. So they're still cash flow positive, but the Coyotes, Florida, I'm looking at this list here and some of the other teams we got here, Columbus,
right, Islanders,
Buffalo, Nashville, they're having big problems. And you got to remember these numbers, these losses that we're showing here includes the huge amount of revenue sharing that they get from the higher revenue teams. Teams like Florida get over $20 million from the high revenue teams. So I don't know. I know Commissioner Gary Bettman doesn't like to move teams, and I know he's convinced specifically that Arizona can make it if they get a new building, and same thing with Florida. But I'm not so sure.
Yeah, and it's weird too. In both cases with Florida and with Arizona, Florida, when they were playing downtown, were drawing pretty well. Now they had a successful team that went to the finals as well. Arizona, I remember going in there and they had the building downtown. And I know it was an old building and some of the seats were blocked for view and everything. Then they both chose to take their arenas outside downtown. And same thing with Ottawa. And that seems to be like a terrible mistake, right? I mean, it's like they've overestimated the ability for the desire for people to drive out miles to a game.
Yeah, Arizona's, they went out to Glendale, and although, as the crow flies may not be that far from Phoenix, right, it's really a different country almost. It was the Phoenix, Arizona model, in my opinion, was based on a flawed premise, which was they were going to develop, the previous owner, Moyes, was going to develop all this real estate,
right,
and, malls and this and that, and that was going to drive people there. And that never happened.
Right.
It went bad. The team went into bankruptcy. The NHL ended up buying it out of bankruptcy. And with Florida, I've always believed that you're better off. The economics are so much better when you can have 2 teams in one arena.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, it just, you get a lot more. I'll throw a word at you that I know you got out of the University of Denver: scale, right? You get scale on your costs.
Did you say I went to the University of Denver? I went to Northern Michigan.
Northern Michigan, that's right. Denver.
Northern Michigan is the Harvard of
Denver. I forgot. We're talking about the Coyotes. Yeah. So I guess what I'm saying is the big thing is, big difference is the Coyotes, you're getting back to writing checks for losses. The Coyotes are owned by Barroway, who is not, relatively speaking, a wealthy guy.
Right.
Florida is owned, I think it's Vinny Viola, pretty rich guy, so he's able to cover those losses. In fact, he was one of the guys that was going to invest with Alex Rodriguez in buying the Mets.
Not only, sorry, Mike, but not only does he have enough money to cover the losses, but he can use those losses on his other. If he has profit on other businesses, he can use that. Right.
That's right. Absolutely. It's not the case with Barroway. I mean, I think it's suspect whether the Coyotes could survive another season under the ownership here. Same ownership group.
Right. And haven't they really kind of exhausted all opportunities to put a new building in that area? I mean, haven't they tried like at the university there and downtown?
Yeah, what they did was they redid the lease a couple of years ago, and basically the team turned over the operations of the arena to the city. So the city runs it. The city did it so their losses would be less in theory. But Bettman has said that the team needs a new arena. Now, the arena is not that old, number one. And number two, the taxpayers there aren't going to fund a new arena because they just went through this terrible experience.
Right. Yeah. And the building, it's relatively new. It's like 15 years or something.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So they don't want to go through this again.
Right. And the reason for a new arena is have it someplace else, like closer to downtown or something.
Exactly. Right. And then the problem there, you get into all the politics because the owner of the Phoenix Suns, Starver, he doesn't want a new building downtown competing with his building.
And why not try to work out a deal where you're a tenant in that building downtown?
That's what they've tried to do too. And if I recall correctly, which I probably won't because I didn't even remember what school you went to, but I think they played some games there, but I think the sidelines were bad. It was kind of like when the Islanders, when they play some games at the Barclays Center, for a lot of the seats, the sidelines aren't that good. So they went to talking about, renovating that building and trying to do it so it could accommodate hockey. And that ran into some problems too. I don't think that Starver is convinced that he could draw the kind of crowd there. In other words, bringing the Coyotes into a new or renovated building where the Suns play, that would make the economics worthwhile. It's similar to, we've heard about over the years, Houston getting an NHL team. It's like the fourth or so largest city in the country. But Tillman Fertitta, who owns the Houston Rockets, has said publicly he doesn't want a hockey team down there. So he just thinks that the fans would not make the economics worth it to support a hockey team.
I heard that. I think the word was too that they'd had a minor league team down there and it didn't draw very well. So they're just assuming that. See, and I think that's a mistake. That's minor league hockey. I think with the league now, with all the stuff that they do with the outdoor games and the television they've got now and everything, it's entertainment. I just think that there's, maybe I'm wrong.
I think that's a good point. I think that some of these owners, I don't think necessarily, you could be a smart businessman and own a basketball team and do great, but you may not necessarily understand the economics of hockey. You hockey guys are weird. It's sort of your own little niche that you have.
Own language, everything. There's no question. Yeah. Yeah. I agree with you. Like who would have thought that hockey would have done so well in Vegas, right? I
was a big skeptic, and I've been proven wrong. Yeah. And now of course you got an NFL team out there as well.
Yeah.
And they're talking about bringing an NBA team out there, and I think a lot of this also is tied to the fact that as we've seen legalized sports betting, grow throughout the country, and particularly younger people with fantasy sports and stuff like that, makes a lot of sense. And it's one of the main ways they're drawing traffic. So
in this process that you go through to figure out what a team is valued at, if let's say I win the lottery tomorrow night and I want to buy an NHL hockey team and I hire a bank. Is that the same process that they're going to use to come up with a valuation for the team?
Yeah, and what they do is when they piece together all the information, of course, they look at past transactions, and basically they look at sale prices relative to revenue. So a premium big market NHL team like the Rangers, the Blackhawks, the Flyers, the Maple Leafs, those teams typically go upwards of 6 times revenue. Sort of the biggest chunk, the middle third, let's say the middle 15 to 20 teams, probably going for about 4 to 5 times revenue. And then the trouble teams that you mentioned go for, maybe 4 to 3 times revenue, somewhere in that range.
Right. So then, roughly speaking, then if the Rangers are valued at $1.6 billion roughly, so their revenue then is what, 275 or something like that?
225 million.
$25 million. Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, we figured when we looked at this, it's interesting when you look at this year's valuations, there were basically sort of 3 main groups. You had the teams that did not change in value. Nobody went up in value. That's the premium teams: Rangers, Maple Leafs, Canadiens, Blackhawks, Bruins. And then you had sort of the middle chunk, which typically went down in the low single digits. And then you had, those are teams like the Dallas Stars, the Penguins, the Oilers, the Blues, the Wild. And then you have the teams that got sort of in the mid to high single digits range: the Blue Jackets, the Panthers, the Coyotes. The big thing is, too, is you got to remember is that in hockey, because the national TV money is small, I think it was, let's say, compare extremes. I think it's like about 30 million per team in the NHL. In the NFL, it's like 240 million per team.
Oh, that much? Oh, wow! I didn't realize it was that much.
Yeah. So what really typically is a big separation between the have and the have-nots in the NHL are the local TV deals.
Right.
And there's your biggest, and that's the money you keep yourself, like from your cable deal. So the Rangers get over 30 million. The Maple Leafs get, I think, a little over 40 million. The Canadiens, I think, at the most, somewhere close to 50 million. So
the Canadiens, in their case, the Canadiens get $50 million from their own TV
deal,
$30 million from the NHL's national deal.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm trying to see if I can find those exact numbers here. But, yeah, that's the big separator. Montreal, the Canes, although they haven't won a cup, since 93, I think, they're still such a strong brand there, have such a long following. So they do really well, and they have French-speaking local TV. They have English-speaking local TV, and of course, Toronto's the biggest city. They still have a huge fan base. So it's that local TV deal is a big separator from the haves and have-nots.
Right. So if you go back, so we've had 2 expansion teams now. So Vegas paid $500 million to have their franchise, correct?
Correct.
And the Seattle Kraken paid $750?
I think it was $650.
$650. Okay. So let's. I want to look here at your valuations. So it's $650. We go down to the Pittsburgh Penguins at number 11 at $650. So there's 11 teams that are at or above the same value as a new team. See, to me, I think that's kind of a good sign for the NHL, right? That they can get $650 million for a new franchise when only 11 other teams are valued at or above that price. It says,
yeah, and I think for both of the teams you mentioned, Tom, part of the reason was the buildings that they were moving in as well. I mean, Seattle is a big market. I think they view the team there as terms of a rivalry with like a Vancouver, which is another big market. It's close there. Right. But they also built a new arena, privately financed arena in Seattle. They renovated, I think it was the old Key Arena where the Seattle Supersonics used to play.
Yeah.
So my debate with Gary Bettman over the years has been, he's always said to me, you can't have any team less than the last expansion team. And I've always argued that's wrong. You can, because the economics of the expansion team is very different from the economics. How can you say the Coyotes, for example, should be valued at the same price as Seattle when Seattle's in a bigger market with a much better building? They've already sold a lot of sponsorships, sold the naming rights to the building. This is all going to generate far more revenue for the Kraken than the Coyotes are ever going to get in Arizona.
And you're not doing just like somebody who is to buy a house. You're not saying, okay, this franchise is worth X dollars, so the one next to it needs to be X plus whatever. You're coming up with this valuations based on actual numbers. Like there's a formula to come up with it. You're not saying, right?
Right. We're looking at all the revenue, all the expenses, and all the positive cash flow or negative cash flow. Because I think, again, unless you're just somebody that wants to buy an NHL franchise as a hobby, if there's if as a business person you're looking at it in terms of the economics as well, it comes down to, again, like we were saying, like if I buy this team over the next 5 to 10 years, how much more money am I going to have to put into the team? Right. Or am I going to be able to take money out of the team or break even? In the NHL, the majority of teams, when they do the budget, they budget for the regular season to be about break even. And so, in other words, if they don't lose money during the regular season, they consider that a good year. And then the playoffs is where they hope to make their gravy. Because, as you know, ticket prices usually go up every round. The player contracts have been budgeted for the regular season and paid off. So that's where you hope to make your money. And it's why the playoffs are so important for the economics of a hockey team. And again, forget this past year, that didn't happen, right? Because you played in a bubble, so there was none of that money.
Right. So
what the NHL was able to do by still having the playoffs was they were able to net out $100 million in national TV money. When I say net out, there was about $70 million of costs that all the teams chipped in, that the league covered really for the pandemic, for all the costs associated with that. So you're able to get that $100 million in national TV money. But the prior 2 years, if you look at the teams that won, like the Blues and the Capitals, those teams generated like over $20 million in extra revenue just from the playoffs.
Right. What was I thinking here? I was thinking with valuations. And again, just to be clear, I mean, but like you go back when the Clippers were sold last time, didn't the guy pay like $2 billion, whoever that was, about the Clippers?
Yeah, well, that spoke really to two things. I think mostly was one, Ballmer was whatever, the third richest person on the planet. I think at the time he was worth about $20 billion. $20 billion, yeah, just a notch above me. He was
there you go. Yeah. You and Steve Cohen.
Yeah. The former Microsoft executive. And two was it was LA. So I think LA and New York are different from any other market. So if you're talking multiples of revenue, again, there are levels above that.
So was it really worth, based on your formula, was it really worth $2 billion? Or
no. I'll tell you two quick, true and funny stories related to that. The previous owner, Sterling, someone had videotaped him saying racist things in his house. And
it was his ex-wife, wasn't it?
I'm not sure it was his ex-wife or his ex-mistress or something like that.
That's right.
Yeah, it was.
That's a great story. I remember that. Yeah.
So I had a meeting set up prior to that videotape being released with a sports banker in New York, and we were just going to get together just to talk about team valuations in general. And so I was in his office and we were talking, and I said, by the way, I said, this video that's been released, I said, let's just suppose that, the NBA comes down on Sterling and makes him sell the Clippers because of this recording. I said, what do you think they'll go for? And this guy, great guy, very smart, and he gets paid to do this. But I think he does more deals over the last 3 years than anybody, either representing a buyer or a seller. And he said, maybe 700 million. So I said, and I was trying to pin him down because our next valuation at Forbes was going to be the NBA. And I said, their local TV deal is set to expire. And some people are thinking it could double or triple. And this is when the local cable deals were really increasing at a rapid rate, especially the ones that had been around for a long time. And he said, maybe $1 billion. He said, okay, you could put $1 billion. Anyway, so, I went ahead and did my valuations. I don't know what we had him at, 950 million or $1 billion or something like that. And I'm thinking, here, I'm really smart. I got all this inside info, right, from this main guy. Here comes Jose, and be like, how did he know that? So high for the Clippers, who are the dog, in LA compared to at that time compared to the Lakers. And here comes Ballmer, and he bids $2 billion for the team.
I remember that. I remember.
Yeah, I remember this. Yeah, the other story related to that, I'll tell you, is I happened to go to I think it was a Gabelli sports conference, a little sports conference in New York after Ballmer bought the team, and somehow I got put on this panel, and on this panel was the attorney who represented the former Mrs. Sterling. Right. So, and she actually was in charge of selling the team. She had won the right to control the auction. Right. And so this guy gets on there and he says in front of everybody, he's like, they were asking him about the Clippers. He goes, Donald Sterling, he said, he said, Steve Ballmer didn't even look at the team's financials.
Right.
He said, bidding started. He said, there were a couple of groups at about 1.4. And he said the ones below him, they were kind of even suspect whether or not they had the money. It was a whole consortium of people. So he said, Ballmer got tired. He said, just called us up one day and said, what do I have to do to end this auction process and just get the team? So we told him $2 billion. And he said, I have to check with my wife. He said, he called back the next day and said, $2 billion it is. So I guess what I'm saying is for some of these prime markets, right. I could sit here for weeks and weeks and crunch numbers and do comparable value to revenue multiples and look at the demographics and all the media contracts. If somebody wants one of these trophy assets, I think the Rangers, Maple Leafs, Canadians for sure are one of those assets. I mean, we have the Rangers at the top of the list at 1.65. I think. Yeah. I mean,
so let me ask you a question. Let's say the Rangers are up for sale, and the same kind of thing happens. Somebody comes in, and although they're valued at 1.65, somebody wants them so bad they plop down $2 billion to buy the team.
Absolutely.
Does that change the valuation of every other team? Then
I don't think so. I think it's something very unique to a couple of really prime markets. I think in the NHL, again, I think those markets are New York, Montreal, Toronto, probably Boston, maybe Chicago.
Right.
It's just something, very, very, and you see that with transactions too.
So if somebody, I know this probably wouldn't happen, but let's say somebody wants to keep a team in Arizona and they've got multi-billions of dollars and they come in and overbid for the Arizona Coyotes. Does that affect everybody else's value because that's not one of the prime markets? Or they just say, listen, that's a one-off. That's some guy that just wanted the team.
No, I think you raise a really fair point. I think something like that could. I think it actually could because when you go to the bottom tier teams, like for instance, we have Columbus valued at $310 million.
Right.
If somebody were to come in and buy Columbus tomorrow and pay $400 million, let's say, that would definitely get me back to the drawing board on this. And you're right. In that case, then you'd have to raise some of these multiples on the bottom tier. But in the NBA, for instance, because the Nets and the operating rights to the arena in 2019 were sold for $3.2 billion. But then you just saw I think it was the Memphis Grizzlies or the Utah Jazz I think Utah Jazz it was just sold. They were sold for like they're going to be sold for 1.6, I think it is. It was very close to our valuation, and the multiple spread. One team being in Brooklyn and the other team being out in Utah. You're going to probably see the same thing with the Timberwolves. Bidding there is about 1.5.
Right.
So the price differential in markets is often very significant.
So our last question here. So if this pandemic continues, and maybe even who knows how long it continues on, but and no people in the stands, are there going to be some casualties here with some of these ownership groups? Are they going to have to move? Are they going to fold, or?
I think sold. I would go to your earlier point that they're more likely to be sold first.
Right.
I think that would be the first step. What we're seeing now is the league as a whole. We mentioned the league starting a lending facility, but they've also now, we're being told, want to go out to the private placement market. That's like when the league goes to somebody like, say, Prudential Insurance, one big insurance company, and says, we want to borrow $1 billion from you. They're in the process of looking at that right now. Now, fortunately for the leagues now that are, and the NBA is borrowing money too. I mean, it's not just unique to the NHL. Fortunately, interest rates are so low right now that it's helping on the expense side. But yeah, I definitely see some casualties, particularly for teams that are not owned by really rich people. The Winnipeg Jets, I think, are owned by the controlling owners, like the richest guy in Canada. The Florida Panthers are owned by a wealthy guy. But teams like Nashville and Arizona, I think, are questionable.
Right. And aren't some teams also, let's say they're getting $20 million a year in TV revenue, or let's say they've got a local TV deal, whatever, they're getting $10 million. Aren't some teams taking advances on that too? So they're getting, if it's a 6-year deal, they're taking some of that up front?
Yeah, well, right now what they're doing is they're smoothing out everything. So even some of the sponsorship money that they've gotten for the arenas, they're saying, we're not going to give it all back to you right now, but we'll make it good to you in future years. They're smoothing out. And again, I just not to be too harsh on the National League, all the sports are doing that. They all are.
All right. Well, great stuff. That's very interesting, Mike. You're actually a very intelligent man. I didn't know that.
Well, you know what? Next time I'll actually hopefully remember where you went to school.
Well, it's questionable whether I went to school at all or not. So you weren't totally wrong in what you said.
Thanks, Tommy. It's always great being with you. I really appreciate it.
Great to see you.
Talk to you soon, bud.
Talk to you.